thank you everyone for coming. This is HackBuddy. We do this learning meetup. We do this every month. We continue to or try. This organization is what for 8-9 years has been going. I've been going to for 6 years to these events, and they've been a lot of fun. So we're going to keep them going. Today we have Alex with us. He's going to talk about Vue. I think it's very exciting. I think it's going to be a great high level talk, and I think I'm very excited because we have a Discord community, and I think we can dive into these topics a little more deeper. I think there's opportunities to kind of get a better understanding of Vue, because at this point, Vue and React are kind of the same thing. They have, there are some differences, but generally hooks, everything's a function, so that makes things just a bit easier. But yeah, if you would like to go to hackbuddy.com, in our footer, we have the join Discord link. Feel free to join us. Again, I don't think I want to talk too much. I'll pass over to Alex. I'm sure he'll explain things, and we can go through this. So I guess the overall, I have a loose, agenda is basically the presentation, and then if we have some time, Q&A, we can help facilitate that. I think we'll try to go in the Q&A section, raised hands or kind of questions in chat. We'll try to organize it so that way we can get them answered. And yeah, I think that's it. I'll pass it over to Alex to help us learn about Vue.
Cool. Thank you. All right. So today we are going to be talking about Vue.js. I have also subtitled this talk "A Series of Fortunate Nerd Snipes," and you'll understand why in a bit. First, we'll get the customary introductions out of the way. Hi, my name is Alex. I am the Atlanta Vue.js organizer. I'm a senior front-end developer, and I am also a written font connoisseur. If you don't like my font choices, deal with it. So let's talk about nerd sniping, because I already brought this up a little bit. Nerd sniping is a term that is coined from the XKCD 356 comic called Nerd Sniping. It has 2 characters in it, and one of them says, hey, there's a type of brain that's very easily distracted. They chit-chat, and then he's like, there's a scientist about to cross the road, and he holds up a sign, and he shows them a problem. At which point the scientist stops, thinks about this problem, and ends up getting hit by a truck. And then there's a point system based on what type of scientist it is. Now, I don't think that we need the trucks or anything like that involved, but this concept of a problem that itches your brain and you just can't let go of it, I run into this all the time. Someone will, like, in passing, say something, and I will suddenly have to drop everything and figure out how that thing works. And I've noticed that at times, with the way that Vue development works, Evan You, the creator of Vue, also has this trait. And I've asked him about it. I was talking to Adam earlier about this. I had dinner with him a couple of weeks ago, and this is a question I got to ask him where I was like, hey, I've noticed sometimes you get nerd sniped, and I had to explain it and show him the comic and all of that stuff. And he's like, yeah, that happens. So I'm not like BSing this. This is legitimately a thing, but we're going to go back in time a little bit, because the earliest instance of this that I can really sort of put my finger on where I noticed it immediately, we have to go back to October 26th, 2018. Now, it sounds like some of you might do some React stuff, maybe, possibly. Anybody here a React person know what October 26th, 2018 is? Why that date's important? Maybe? No? Yeah? You? Okay. All right. So the reason that date is important is because that is the day at ReactConf 2018 that Dan Abramov introduced to the world for the first time React hooks. And this, like, was a revolution to a certain extent within the JavaScript community, and it set off the minds and imaginations of multiple different framework workers and like how we approach writing components and writing component-based stuff and thinking about reactivity and thinking about state. And it's a bit of a nerd's night moment, because the next day, not even 12 hours later, on October 27th, 2018, Evan Yu tweets, "Okay, I really can't help myself. Use hooks in Vue with a userland lib under 100 lines of code." And then a code sandbox. So this is like Evan just straight up being nerd sniped completely, right? Like somebody says, "Here's an interesting way of doing things," and Evan goes, "Oh, you can do that with Vue." Now this is Vue 2 at this point, right? So the code itself is actually, it's a very it's a bit clunky, right? But we have our, count, set count, use state, use effect. We can use window width. We're doing a bunch of like pseudo JSX stuff. I have no idea if you can see that. And then we render it in a Vue app. And if you look at the preview of it, you can see here, look, that window width stuff is working and our counters are working. So there we go. So the code itself actually works pretty well, which is surprising. But, this is late 2018. So less than a year later, you can tell that this has been sitting on the mind of Evan and the core team really for a while, because they present a new idea. Now, on June 7th, 2019, prior to this, the core team had known for years that Vue 3, the big breaking change in Vue 3, was the reactivity system. We were going from, object.define property to be able to set getters and setters on an object, to using proxy objects, which allow us to sort of dynamically do the same thing, but in better and more robust ways. So on June 7th, 2019, a new RFC, which is a request for comment, it's sort of a system for being able to propose new ideas. They propose a new function-based component API. And this is what becomes the basis for the composition API in Vue 3. Now, the original messaging of this was not so fantastic. It was a bit awkward. Everybody thought that we were going to be replacing the options API, which is the classic Vue API, with the, composition API. And so it got a bit muddled, but eventually, about a year and some change later, Vue 3 is fully released. It has the new reactivity system using proxy objects. It has the composition API fully baked into it with the setup method. And the other feature that is like, I like to put here, because it's one of those hallmark Vue 2 things that they removed in Vue 3, and there are a lot of people still angry about it, is that they removed filters. And filters is just sort of like a fancy way to sort of inline a method. So I get why they removed it. There's a lot of people still bitter about that. But let's talk about sort of the difference between the options API and the composition API, because it sounds like some of y'all may not have written Vue before. So the options API is sort of the classic way of writing a Vue component. You have a data method inside of an object that you're exporting, and that's going to return an object with all of the properties that you want to be reactive, right? So we have a count value here, right? And then similarly, we have our methods section, and our methods section has an increment function, and the increment function will just increment this dot count, right? So in your template, you would be able to have a click handler that calls increment, and then you can inline the count value with a double curly bracket. Now, the templating has not changed at all. Templating is basically identical. Once you get really deep into it, there's some changes, but for what it's worth, it's pretty much identical. Where it changes, though, is with the composition API. So with the composition API, we now have a setup function. And within that setup function, we can write our reactive data from either ref, which is an object with a dot value on it that you can then update the value, or you can use reactive as another way where you just give it an array or an object or something, and it will be able to track that. And then we'll also have an increment function, similarly, where it just increments count dot value plus plus. And then we return count and increment, and then our template is identical, right? And so the way you think about how to do this is much more of a React-based thing than it is a Vue-based thing. And so it's taken a long time to get people on board with this way of doing it, but I think more and more people are coming around to it. Now, while developing Vue 3, Evan, I'm pretty sure, had a moment where he was sitting there and he started to get frustrated because at that time, when you're doing JavaScript development, it was really like Webpack based, right? And he noticed that it's, gosh, Webpack is slow, right? And this had churned for a while. I don't know if there was a specific thing that triggered this or what, but it was sitting there. It was bubbling for a bit, and eventually he made an experiment. It's a proof of concept server called Vue Dev Server, and what it allows you to do is that you could run that, and then it will use ES module imports in the browser. And so if you want a Vue file, you just request that Vue file from the server, and it will compile that one file right there, right? And so that way, if you're wanting to do development, you can just do development on that one file and only recompile that one file over and over and over. And so this is sort of a proof of concept sort of a thing. And he noticed this is actually good. What if we build this out more? What if we did more with this? And so he made a new build system that was specifically for Vue called Vite. Now, Vite 1.0 never got released. It only got as far as release candidate 13. Because at release candidate 13, once you're in release candidate, you do not add new features. You only do bug fixes to make sure everything works. So we're in release candidate, and he goes, hey, if we change a couple of things, we fix this thing here, we fix that thing there, this could actually be useful for other language, like other systems. Like you could do React with this, you could do Svelte with this, you could do anything with it. You could do Angular, you could do whatever you wanted to. Well, we can't make that change because we're in release candidate. And so they scrapped it. They scrapped version 1. They just said, we're never releasing it, never got to version 1. Version 1 of Vite does not exist. It only got as far as release candidates. A few months later, though, they released Vite 2.0. And Vite 2.0 is the basis for the thing that we use today, which is the current implementation of Vite, where it's able to support React, support Svelte. Other build systems are building on top of Vite because it's so fast and because it has good dev experience. So it's a tool that was originally supposed to just be a Vue dev server and became much more useful to the wider JavaScript ecosystem. And this is sort of a recurring theme within the stuff that Evan does, where he's like, if I can make something that doesn't just benefit my thing, but benefits everything, I'm going to do that. Now, this one was sort of, it's a little bit harder to tie these ideas and things together, right? I kind of had to force that one into being a nerd snipe. It's a bit of a nerd snipe, but as a better example of a nerd snipe, what I have is after the version 3.1 release of Vue, which was in 2021, like a week later, a post went up on Twitter from Matt Stauffer, who's a speaker. He does stuff in PHP. He does stuff with Vue, and he gave a talk about Alpine.js. Now, for those of you who don't know what Alpine.js is, Alpine.js is it's built on top of the Vue reactivity system, but rather than having like components and all of that sort of stuff, it's designed for like, okay, you're already building stuff server side with PHP, Java, C#, whatever, right? And you need some reactivity sprinkled in. Alpine is a great way to do it because it just works on the HTML. You just write it out on the HTML and it handles all of the stuff. And so he gave a talk about it. Now, I did not see this tweet originally. The thing that I saw, though, was Evan responding to it because he got a little upset about this talk and the slides. The slides apparently compared the full version of Vue, right, with the template compiler and all of the bells and whistles and all of the things to the gzipped version of Alpine, which is about 8.5 kilobytes. So you have like this like 40, 50 kilobyte thing versus a 8.5 kilobyte thing. He's like, that's not fair. That's an unfair comparison. And that really got him. I know that this one got him because a month later, he makes this tweet where he says, hey, what if we just imported a thing called Petite Vue and then sprinkled in some Vue directives? And it looks very much like Vue, but we're not having to like write all the boilerplate of like create a Vue app, create all of this stuff, right? It just sort of does its thing. And he made Petite Vue. Petite Vue is only 6 kilobytes. It's a Vue compatible template syntax. It's DOM based, and once again uses the Vue reactivity system. Now, I'm not going to tell you to use Petite Vue. Use Alpine. It's much more, Alpine is much more stable and more robust and has better features. But this is an interesting concept of like, he sees something and then has to build it, right? He has to build like an implementation of it just to get it out of his system. Now, we've talked about sort of the composition API a little bit. We've touched on that a little bit, and we've touched on like the difference between the options API. But there was another conversation that happened back in 2018. You remember this? You remember when we talked about React hooks? So back in 2018, the other conversation that was happening was actually with Rich Harris. Rich Harris is the creator of Svelte, which is a compile. The reactivity is calculated at compile time rather than at runtime. It's a very interesting idea. I won't go too in depth into it, but Svelte 2 was out at the time, and Rich Harris looked at how React hooks worked, and he was like, well, but what if we didn't need to like have a function? What if we just wrote like values in a script tag and then we let the compiler figure it out, right? And he sort of imagined like you just put a script tag in there, you define some values, you're good to go. And Evan chimed in and they had a whole conversation about this. And it was very interesting watching them go back and forth. But I think this idea stuck in Evan's mind because an experimental feature was added later in the version, in the initial version of Vue 3. So like I think it was Vue 3.0.8 or something like that. But this experimental feature was the script setup syntax, where it looks a lot like Svelte 3, which is where this concept comes from of like just define values in a script tag and let the compiler figure it out. And in Vue 3.2, script setup syntax became an actual part. Like it's no longer experimental, it's a full feature and it's fully supported. And it once again has changed how you write Vue components, because we've already got this setup function syntax. So what if we make that easier, right? So with the composition API, this is sort of the same thing that we've been looking at all along. We have our, we're exporting an object that has that method with syntax. What if you just define the values and let the compiler figure it out? And so you reduce the size of the component. It's all still JavaScript, but it's still the same thing. Now, this has been both controversial and lauded as being, this is fantastic, and also this is terrible. So like, people have very strong opinions about this. I don't personally use it, but I might have to start to in the future, and we'll see about that in a minute. Now, the current version of Vue is Vue 3.3. It's got a bunch of like developer experience stuff. There's not any new features that I can be like, ooh, big shiny feature, you should, go try it because it has this thing, right? Like, it's just a bunch more like extra TypeScript and like developer experience stuff, but there's nothing about it that's really like, ah, yes, like here's the thing. So let's talk about what the future of Vue looks like. So the future of Vue is a bit difficult to talk about because there's not been any big advancements in frameworks, really, right? Like, there's nothing really in frameworks that has changed. There's nothing like new and unique that is like super exciting and is sort of like pushing the boundaries of, okay, well, there's solid.js doesn't use virtual DOM. So it uses JSX, but then it compiles it into what it wants to. But it uses a signals-based system. So it's not like React, but it looks like React, but it looks like Vue, but it doesn't look like Vue. It's this weird amalgam of like these two systems. And what it does is that rather than creating a virtual DOM, where when you render a component, it creates an object structure that matches the DOM, and then it goes through and compares it to the previous version, and then figures out what needs to change, and then changes the thing. What it does is that it just keeps a reference to the element and then changes the thing. So there's none of this like weird, like, oh, you have to match values up and stuff like that. So Evan and the core team really have presented Vapor mode for Vue. So Vapor is the new feature. It is an opt-in mode that will remove the virtual DOM. So rather than having to render out that large object structure and keep a virtual version of the DOM next to the actual DOM, it'll just not do that. And it's an opt-in thing, so you can opt in at the component level. You can also make an entire application this way. And it only works with script setup, because that's where really big compiler transformations are already happening. And the good news is, though, is that if you do need virtual DOM for stuff, right, if you're using Vuetify, which is a material design package that can be brought in and gives you lots of components, it's beautiful, it's wonderful, they do a lot of really good stuff, that uses virtual DOM very heavily. So if you want to be able to use Vapor mode stuff, you'll be able to just sub it right in and won't disturb anything. So I know that conceptually, like, I've said all of these things, so let's look at what it actually looks like. So in normal mode, right, the thing that we're currently doing, if we look at our mycounter.vue, it compiles to the code here in the JS file, right? It imports a bunch of stuff, and then it's like doing a bunch of things to it. And the key difference here is that we have a render function, right? In Vue, we do have render functions. It's what the template compiles into. And what it does is that it goes through and it creates an element block, right, which is a div, and then it has a button as a child, right, inside of it, and then it's going to have a click handler, and the click handler has count.value plus plus, blah blah blah, right? So that's what it compiles to. But that means every single time that you click the button, it has to create that div, it has to create that button, it has to, right? It's having to like do all of this stuff. And that's a lot. That's a lot of code to make that sort of thing happen. So the proposed change looks more like this. Vapor mode, you would add a .vapor.vue to the end of your component name. And then we'd have our same script setup, the exact same component as it's written. But now inside of our Vapor component JavaScript, we're importing some stuff from a different library, a Vapor library with template and on and set text. Template allows you to create elements and maybe track them as well. We set up our count value that we need to be reactive. We get the actual elements that we need to use here. And then we use effect. So effect is sort of our way of, I think it's similar to like use effect, I think, in React, where you can say, hey, track this value, like here's the value I want you to track these. But in Vue, we don't have to specify the value because of the way that the Vue reactivity system works. We can just, it tracks it based on when you access the value. So by accessing the value inside of the function that we pass to it, it tracks it, right? It's magic. Vue is magic. There's a lot of magic stuff happening in the background, which you don't have to think about, which is what frameworks do. And it also adds a click handler to the button. So we're setting the text of the button, and that'll change every single time that we update the value, the count.value, and then we can update the count.value when it clicks the button. And we no longer return a render function. We just return the element that is the root element of the thing. And we're done. And that's it. So rather than going through this complicated step of like creating a virtual DOM and doing all of this stuff, it just updates the element that's already there. And, it's a lot more complicated than that, especially when you're doing stuff with like if statements and like, optionally rendering something, right? But ultimately, it's a lot faster. It's a lot faster because you're not having to maintain multiple copies of what exists on the page. You just use the page as the reference. And so that's what Vapor mode looks like. It's very exciting. I'm excited to see where that one goes. I had to do a lot of research for this talk to understand what the heck they were talking about, and I still don't fully understand what it was that they were talking about. So if you're lost, don't worry, so am I. But this is sort of in Vue land, but there's a wider ecosystem, right? There's a wider ecosystem of tools within Vue that get used. So in React, you have Next. Everybody loves Next.js, blah, 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 right? We have Nuxt because we're bad at naming things. Nuxt is a project. It works exactly like Next. Not exactly, very similarly to Next, right? Like you can just create pages, you can create routes, you do all of the routing and all the stuff, and like it has like magic things happening inside of it. It's great. It's a great system. But the team that makes Nuxt also has another project that they've started, that they've been contributing to, called the Vue.js project, where rather than making the tools specifically for Nuxt, they go, well, what if we made this thing slightly more generic, and then you could just use it wherever you wanted to, right? So a good example of this is that I think they have the unmodule package, which is you need to write a loader for Webpack and Vite and Parcel and whatever, Gulp, I don't know, like whatever build system that you're using. And you need to write a loader for your new thing that you're making. And so rather than having to maintain 4 different repositories to handle something that essentially does the same thing, they've made a wrapper that you can write it once and say, make a thing that works for all of these, and it'll work for all of those. And it gives you a Webpack loader and a Vite loader and a whatever, right? So it ties into all of those. And so this comes from from that Nuxt ecosystem. There are other projects in there too of what was the other good one? I think Nitro is part of the Vue.js project, where it's work very closely with it. But Nitro is another tool where you write a generic way of handling an API endpoint or whatever. So if but you're going to want to be able to put it on Netlify or Vercel or AWS or Azure, or you're putting it in Express. You write it once with this, and then you say export this using this type of handler for it, right? And it'll figure out how to export it for that system. So this is used by Astro. I think this might actually be used by Eleventy. Don't quote me on that. But like it's used by several other projects. And so like they're making tools that are not just benefiting them, but it's benefiting other projects as well that are outside of the Vue ecosystem. Speaking of Astro, Astro is another wider ecosystem thing. Astro and Îles are projects that use the islands architecture. So the islands architecture is fantastic in that it takes your JavaScript project that you're rendering server side, and it delivers none of the JavaScript to the browser unless you tell it to, which sounds really weird at first, but there's so much, when you start building an application, there's so much of that application you start to realize it's like, oh, why am I sending JavaScript for that? Like, it's a static piece, it's a static thing that lives at the top of the page. It's never going to change, right? Like, reducing that JavaScript bundle is huge. And Astro, I think Îles is specifically for Vue, but it might actually support other things. Astro supports whatever you want to, and they have their own component format. But just sort of like, you have to specifically tell them like, hey, this component that I'm putting on the page needs to be interactive on the client side. And then they'll figure out like, oh, okay, here's how much JavaScript we need to send over to do that. Another tool within the wider ecosystem, and once again, this sort of ties into like helping others and not just focusing on Vue, but focusing on sort of JavaScript as a whole, is Volar. So Volar is our language editor tool that like works in VS Code, helps do the highlighting, helps do the syntax like lookup and all of that sort of stuff, and all of that sort of parsing. It was originally created as sort of the next gen Vue tooling for VS Code. And then once again, they realized like, if we just change a couple of things, we can make this work for any system. Like anybody could use this to build an extension for VS Code in sort of a more generic way. And so it's used in VS Code. But JetBrains with like WebStorm, PHP Storm, IDJ, they just picked it up and they're using it as well in their newer versions. So it's this tool that's like helping developer experience, helping like developers get stuff done. And maybe you aren't interacting with it directly. Maybe you're not importing it directly into your code, but you might be using it and you might not know that you're using it. So that's sort of like where I think the future of a lot of stuff in the Vue ecosystem is going, is not necessarily to be lock you into Vue. It's use this to do things however it is you need to do it. And so that is where the Vue ecosystem is going. Thank you very much. Hopefully that was helpful and I didn't just meander all over the place.
That was great, Alex. I really enjoyed that. Yeah.
Yeah, great job. That was a really good presentation. Let's open it up to questions for the community first, and then if there aren't any questions, we can also ask our own as well.
Because there is a lot of stuff I have not covered in this talk. So yeah, if you have questions, if you're like, can you explain this a little bit more? Feel free. I am a cornucopia of information. So
also, you can write a question in the chat too if you are feeling camera shy or mic shy. I know that's a thing, so feel free to write a question and we'll read it out loud. I guess I'll kind of ask just because so for me, Vue is actually sort of a near and dear topic to me because for a while this year I was actually sort of facing a little bit of unemployment, and so I had to interview at a lot of different places, and Vue came up like 3 or 4 times. So I didn't know that much Vue. I had been a React person, but I had to try to get the job. So I studied Vue pretty intently, and then I tried doing a lot of the homework assignments that these companies would throw out. I remember going through all the different iterations of Vue, Vue 2, Vue 3, because some companies use Vue 2, some people use Vue 3. And yeah, so for me, this was a good refresher in some ways. I guess like my main question would be like, I mean, you definitely did a lot of research, which I commend you for. Do you feel like Vue kind of moves maybe too fast for the real world? Do you feel like by the time someone picks it up, maybe there's already like a brand new version that they shouldn't be using? Because there, I think like it was first like the composition, or I may be getting this backwards, but there's like the basic one, options library, composition library. Now there's like a Vapor library.
Mhm.
Should people be using Vapor in production? This kind of stuff, you know?
Yeah, good question. So the challenge that we're having like within the Vue community currently is adoption of Vue 3. Part of that has been a lot of the libraries that work in Vue 2 that were well established, having them get to be Vue 3 compatible has been a huge hurdle. There's actually one GridSum is a Vue 2 framework that is sort of equivalent to like Gatsby almost, but they've never, I think they started getting it to work in Vue 3 and then just kind of gave up. And there's not been much movement there. I don't know if they're actually going to do it. Right. So like we've had that being an issue. And so, but then also that means that like there's space for other people to step in and be like, I'm creating a new thing. This is going to replace this old thing that is not being updated. And a lot of the frameworks and stuff had tied into like very deeply into like how Vue works and like all sorts of stuff like this. And you know, accessing private APIs within the thing that it's like, yes, it's there, but you shouldn't touch that. That's an internal API. It could change. And so like if you base your system around how something works internally, when it changes how it works internally, you have to rewrite it, right? Like you have to rewrite the whole system. Vuetify is a good example of that. They were handwriting render functions rather than using like JSX or templates or whatever to write the actual rendering stuff. And because they hand render functions and the signature of how the rendering, this is getting super technical, but in Vue 2, rendering, the render function, like the way that you return virtual DOM is like the function that you call is completely different signature wise than in Vue 3. And so they had to go through component by component and rewrite every single component to work with the Vue 3 system. And I think they actually switched over to TypeScript and JSX, so it's TSX or whatever. But like they're now using like a compiler thing because they were like, we shouldn't have done it that way. But that's sort of the thing, is that like we're in this weird state of like, should I learn Vue 2? Should I learn Vue 3? Right? You should learn Vue 3. If anybody's questioning, you should learn Vue 3. Should learn Vue 3. I would start with the options API because it's the easiest. And if you find old examples, they'll pretty much work. The composition API, if you're coming from a React, composition API may actually be easier for you to learn. So that might be the better way to go. I don't know. I can't say, but we are having, I think there is a challenge of like, what is the correct way to do it? And the correct way is however you want to. And that's not a good answer. Like, and like that was the big controversy with script setup, is that they're like, okay, there's a third way to write, you're making we just got a second way and you're making a third way to write things. And so like it's been that basically. But like I don't think it's moving too fast. Because for the most part, when you're like, if you're having to migrate from Vue 2 to Vue 3, there's a migration build. Version 3.1 was the migration build. There's a Vue compatibility tool where you can import it and it'll tell you like, oh, okay, you're doing this thing, you want to change that because this is how it's going to look in like the next version, sort of a thing, that you can bring in, and it'll give you all the errors that you need to be able to do that. But like if you're moving from 2 to 3, stick with the options API, right? They released Vue 2.7, which backported a lot of features from Vue 3 to Vue 2. So if you're really wanting to get that like composition API stuff going in your Vue 2 code base, you can, right? So it's one of those things where like you don't have, it's not an all or nothing. It's an incremental, like, oh, you want to start using this thing here? Great, go ahead, go for it. You can also mix and match. You can actually do composition API and options API in the same component. Like it's not mutually exclusive. You can just mix a whole bunch of stuff together. It gets a little weird, but like, it works. So yeah, I don't think it's moving too fast. If anything, I would say, as someone who sat there waiting for 2 years for Vue 3 to come out, I really don't think it's moving too fast. So that was a very painful time, and I was talking to people in the core team, so I was aware of things that were coming, but there was like no messaging about it, nothing. So I was aware of all of these changes that were coming, and I was building Vue 2 code bases with like, nope, don't do that, nope, don't do that, nope, don't do that, right? Because I knew all these changes were coming, but other people didn't. And so I think a lot of people it did catch off guard. So I had some heads up, but yeah, it could very easily be not great. But yeah, no, the hardest thing about learning it right now is like, what do I learn? And it's start with the options API, understand like how reactivity stuff works, and then move to composition API. And then if you're excited, move to script setup.
Vapor. Okay. Let me ask you another question just for time. We have a question from Ching. He says, what is the landscape of frameworks or tools to run Vue in mobile devices, desktop, etc.? Will it have native support?
So I know with Vue 2, there was a framework that's primarily in Chinese, which is why I've never used it. But it was, so Vue has very large adoption in China. Evan is from China, so it has very large adoption there. And so docs are always written like in both English and Chinese, like it's one of those things. But so there has been a system that does like mobile native stuff. I have never been able to properly read the documentation for that. So I don't know where it is in the ecosystem, like if it's made the jump to Vue 3, if it's still stuck on Vue 2, what's going on with it. I think it's called Weeks though, Weex. Don't have to look it up. But I know that there are options. I don't do as much mobile development, which is why I'm sort of floundering here. I do know that there are options. I know that Vue 3 is written much more modularly than Vue 2 was. Vue 2 was very much like, all right, here's the reactivity system and a little bit of the rendering system in there, right? Like it was like everything was sort of like in weird, like spaghetti code-ish almost. It was very hard to like separate things out. And with Vue 3, they were really like, okay, no, here's the reactivity system. Here's the rendering system. Rendering stays over here. So like if you want a different rendering system, you just build a different rendering system and there you go. So like integrating it with another system that would do native development is going to be a lot simpler in Vue 3 than it would have been in Vue 2, because you would have had to be like working around whatever DOM compiler was in there already. Does that, hopefully that answers your question a little bit. I know that there are packages out there. I think Ionic has support for Vue. And I feel like native script, is that still a thing? I think native script does. But like these are the only, like Weeks, native script, and Ionic are the only 3 that I remember off the top of my head, because I think I know people that work there. So yeah.
If we have other questions, feel free to add them. Adam, I just want to turn out at you too. Do you have any questions as well, or
Yeah,
comments?
sure.
I know you've been working.
No, yeah. Yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you, Alex. This has been great. I jumped on the Vue 2 train because of because I didn't get React at the time, and both the community and the documentation really helped out. I think the nice thing about Vue 3 documentation especially is the ability, the code examples switch between the composition API and the options API, which is like so much, it's so great. Do you know of any other resources that kind of that provide that context for somebody who's kind of maybe has an understanding like JavaScript, but kind of needs to figure out how Vue works?
That's a good question. I mean, I don't know of anybody else who does specifically the like toggle between the two.
I guess it could be either or
if you're wanting, yeah. Like the big names in the Vue community for like if you're wanting like better tutorials and blah 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 blah. This is not an ad. Is Vue Mastery. They are big supporters, like their subscription service and stuff. A significant portion of their subscription stuff goes, the profits that they make go back into Vue development. And then the other one is Vue School. They're also very popular. And so they would, I would imagine that they have resources for both options. And some of that is because, and I'm saying this because in part, let me stop sharing my screen so that I don't have that. I'm saying this in part because some of it is that when you're learning Vue, you need to know like options API and composition API. And then once you get into like using it and you bring in certain libraries, those libraries are going to have interfaces that may like lay on top of whichever one that you're using, right? Sorry. And so because they're on top of, a lot of times they're already opinionated about how to use them. So for instance, there is a fantastic collection of tools called Vue Use, which is, it's just like composition API functions for days. Like, oh, you need a fetch handler? Here's use fetch, right? Like it's great. Like it's super fantastic. And usually it's like, if I need to do something in Vue where it's like, oh, I need like a resize observer or something like that, I'm just like, let me go see what they have and just pull that in, right? But like using those, you're not going to be able to use them with the options APIs effectively. You still have to use like the composition API and then define something and then like, right? So like you're having to do all of this weird stuff. And so it's one of those where it's like you have to understand like where this thing gets used, and the hope is that most of the things will have good documentation about how to use the tool. So that's always the challenge, is finding good documentation. But I think the Vue docs are really the only ones where like they have sort of the toggle between the two code examples.
So another question for you, actually, off the top of my head, if you were to lead a project tomorrow, which framework would you use? Well, which version of Vue would you use? We already know which you'd use.
Oh, yeah. I would use Vue 3. Actually, it's a really fun question because it depends on what the project is, right? Astro has actually really changed how I think about like static site stuff. I previously was working at a digital agency based in San Diego, and we did a lot of Vue stuff. And so Astro came onto the scene and we started building stuff in Astro because we could build like marketing pages and stuff like that in Astro. And like suddenly it was like, oh, okay, yeah, no, we get all of the benefits, but we don't have any of the JavaScript going over that we don't need. And so like I'm a big Astro person at the moment. I'm like, yeah, let's do Astro stuff. But looking into Solid, right? I hadn't really looked into Solid before giving this talk. And so now having looked into Solid, I'm like, that is a very appealing like concept, the way that they've gone about doing things. Similarly with like, if you're building like a single page application, Svelte might actually be the right option for you, right? So I'm a little bit more like, Vue is, if I'm having to do something, yeah, it's going to be Vue. But like if I'm suggesting to someone who is not necessarily a Vue person, but is like, what should I do next? How should I do this? My answer may change depending on what it is that they're trying to do. I'm also a big web components guy, custom elements guy. Vue has a feature where you can like bring in a Vue component and you just say define custom element and it becomes a custom element, and you can like you just put a Vue element on the page and it just works. You don't have to instantiate an app or anything like that. So like, you know, I get excited about weird things, and you know, but yeah, so that's sort of my answer. Is I'm like, it depends on like what you're doing, right? Like Vue is the best for like if you're needing to sprinkle it in on top of a code base and you need to be able to do like compilation stuff like that. Vue is gonna probably be the one that I suggest, because it has that built in. You can do the template rendering within the browser. So basically, like you can write your HTML with all of your Vue components, and then like say this is the app, this is the template for the app, and it'll go through and it'll just like render all of those, which you can't do with React, you can't do with Svelte, you can't do, right? Like so like you need like context.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Like, I think as far as just building some kind of like, again, like you said, maybe like a new static site or something like that. I feel like, yeah, maybe this might be a good framework. View, and maybe again, Vue 3 may be a good idea because the documentation is very good, and I think team members working with you can probably pick it up. Those are like things that I think, most how easy is it to implement, how much time will it take, and will the rest of the team be able to follow and keep this thing going for like 1 or 2, 3 years, let's just say. So I'm actually kind of like parroting like what I hear from the other side somewhat with these questions. So yeah, thank you for your input. One more question from Ching I see here is there a
No,
roadmap to
because we're
V4?
still on
You
3.
wanna-
I think my understanding is that if there's a Vue 4, it'll be like removing the options API that happens. So that'll probably be like 5 years at the soonest that would happen. There would need to be some sort of major change in the JavaScript ecosystem where like we need to rewrite the reactivity system for that to be but if you ever want to see like what people are proposing as changes to Vue, there is the github.com/Vue.js/RFC, I think, repo, where it has sort of like, here's all the things that have been proposed and been accepted. Here are the things that are currently proposed, and here's how to read them. Here's your time to comment on them. Of like, this is a terrible idea because it breaks this and this and this and this and this. I saw one the other day that I was like, that doesn't make sense why you would want to do that. And then like I read one of the examples and I'm like, okay, that does make sense why you would want to do that, right? Like it was one of those weird things where somebody was proposing like a fragment component, and I'm like, you just use a template element, like that's literally what. And like I had to read it a couple of times, and it's like an optional template. It was weird. It's like one of those weird like Vue things where it's like once you get into the weird nitty gritty, like it starts behaving oddly. But yeah, like it's one of those where like you can go see what people are proposing, and then when they accept something you can be like, oh, okay, this is the thing that's coming up. And so that would be the place to keep up to date with changes, check in on every once in a while. It's not super fast moving. It's not like every day there's like 200 new proposals or something like that. It's like once every 2 months there's like 2 new proposals that might be close to being accepted, and maybe there's like 10 that have been like, no, we're not doing that. So that is definitely a place to keep up with stuff. The other thing to keep up with is the changelog of the Vue core repository, because it's pretty detailed about the things that are broken and things that are being fixed. So yeah. So those are my recommendations about that.
All right. Yeah, just final 2 minutes here. You know, obviously, if you have any more questions, at this time, you know, we'll take them by like Discord, or you can send them to myself or Adam. I'll put a link for my email here as well, and my LinkedIn if you want it. But just essentially, yeah, just reach out to us. We'll try to put together all the notes from today's meetup and any links discussed, you know, along with the YouTube video when it comes out. As far as when the video comes out, it's usually within 1 or 2 weeks of the recording. We just need a little bit of time of editing to do. But essentially, yeah, you'll be able to watch this video afterwards. And if you have comments, then too, leave them in the comments in the YouTube video, and we'll reach out to Alex. So, yeah, any final thoughts from anyone? Adam, Alex?
I mean, I've been using Vite recently. I switched from
It's
Webpack. Vite. I'm
Vite.
sorry. You're right. I Vite, right? I should make sure yeah, Vite. I've been using Vite recently. I switched over from Webpack, and because it took me 3 weeks to configure the Webpack that I was just for prototyping, and it took me a day. It took me a day to get a Vite, sorry, configuration, which has been great. So I've been enjoying everything that the team has been coming up with, and it's exciting to see on the open source side.
Yeah, it's super great. I'm super excited about it. It's all really cool. They've also Evan has a great talk that he gave the State of the Union where he talks about some of the like upcoming JavaScript proposals, and they're like, we're keeping an eye on these because that's going to change how we do things. So it's very fun to watch that sort of stuff. So I'm glad that people are enjoying the Vue ecosystem and all of the tooling coming out of it.
All right. Thank you again, Alex, and thank you everyone for coming. If you have any questions, I've left my email and my LinkedIn here. I've left actually the main one for HackBuddy and for JavaScript.la.net. Feel free to reach out to us for anything, including beyond just Vue. You can ask us about React or JavaScript in general, or software engineering in general. We've kind of moved out of just JavaScript. We're also kind of like very much now about software engineering. So you can ask about that stuff. You have I think kind of the nice thing about this group is you have almost 10 years, you know, of mentorship experience. So if you're looking for people who can help you get to like, you know, the next place, feel free to reach out to myself or anyone, you know, like you meet today, and network. And we wish you all the best with your career. All right. Thank you all. Thanks, Alex.